to get into a lesson real quick about just kind of general concepts in ecology and paleontology and all the ways that we sort of study ecosystems, because I know a lot of people are interested in Monster Hunter particularly, and I think if you want to learn more about it, probably one of the most effective ways to do that is to do it by first learning some basic concepts about, the ways in which we study ecosystems. I got 3 or 4 people in chat right now, which is great, and I think I will go on ahead and start the lecture, because probably more folks will come by and stay around if I'm actually talking about something instead of just sitting at this title screen. So obviously, the main question regarding this is, how do we actually do this study of ecosystems? What sort of techniques are involved in looking at an ecosystem and finding out how it functions? And there are a variety of approaches that we can use to do this. There's a variety of concepts, a variety of disciplines that can be used to look at ecosystem science. Probably the most wide-reaching one is ecology. Ecology is the study of generally how organisms interact with their environment. So when we're looking at ecology, it's studying how living things interact with both other living things and non-living things. And there are many, many examples of this sort of ecological interaction within Monster Hunter, of course. Most notably, I picked out a few examples here. We have Ray down here. This is an example of predation. Oh, I'm sorry, there's an echo. All right, I will see if I can adjust that. I'll mute the audio there. Okay, we should be better in terms of the echo now. Thank you, Minislave, for calling that out. So this is Ray down here. This is an example of predation. This is one kind of interaction. This is obviously an interaction between 2 living things. It's an interaction between one organism and another organism. But we also have examples of organisms not necessarily interacting in a way that affects both organisms in a particularly notable way. So we have Amstridians down here. This is an interaction that we would categorize as amensalism. You've probably heard of symbiotic relationships before, and there are a lot of different ways to categorize them. We're not going to get super into that just now, but amensalism is a type of symbiotic relationship in which one organism is benefiting and the other organism is almost completely unaffected. So the Amstridian making its nest on the tree here is really not affecting the tree in any negative way overwhelmingly. So this is an example of an amensal reaction between the Amstridian over here and the tree that it's building its nest on, but it needs that tree to build its nest. So the Amstridian is absolutely deriving a benefit from this interaction. Another kind of example is an interaction between organisms and the non-living parts of their ecosystem. Up here, we have a Balahara. Balahara is a large leviathan that lives in the Windward Plains. I'm sure you know. Or if you're not aware of Monster Hunter, then maybe you don't know. In that case, welcome to our lovely community. Balahara up here is a digging animal. It spends a lot of its time moving through dirt, and when it does so, it shifts that dirt around. If Balahara did not exist, the Windward Plains ecosystem would look very different because they shake up that sand. They move it into many different places. Hello, Splift. Welcome. So Balahara, when it moves through the sand here, is really, really significantly altering the sort of layout, the distribution of these sand grains. It's doing what we call bioturbation, which is any sort of movement of the sediment of an area or the changes in the geology of an area by an individual organism. Some people like to call animals like this ecological engineers. Beavers are a very, very great example of animals that affect their ecosystem by moving parts of it around. Balahara, in this case, is, changing the distribution of the sand grains and doing that sort of thing just by moving through them and filtering through them. This is an example of an anthropogenic change being put out. Humans are parts of their ecosystems. This is something that is very important to understand when you're looking at ecology. We as humans are parts of the ecosystems that we inhabit. And our actions Could you explain what the layout would roughly look like if they didn't exist? Well, so if Balahar wasn't there, the layout of the Windward Plains, instead of having these like great big like mixes of sand dunes, and in the areas where Balahar inhabits there, the sand is all kind of mixed in together, you would get what's called stratification, because if Balahar were not moving through there and constantly shifting them around, the sand would be organized into like different components based on the density of the sand that's laid down. Balahar is basically like if you took a blender in here, if you put oil into water, for example, that oil, because it's less dense than the water, will rise to the top and sit on top. It'll be what's called, it'll be stratified. And you would expect to see stratification of the dunes in the Windward Plains, but you get instead these dune structures that are very varied because Balahar is moving through them. Gormagala actually does have eyes. They're just very underdeveloped. Thank you for whoever gave the gift. Do you believe that Balahars live in burrows as a community or alone? What's their social life like? I will get into that in a little bit. I think Balahar are quite social. They tend to travel in groups of 2 or 3. But it's unclear if they have complex social structures or if they just kind of hang out together. I don't know if they're in defined family groups. It seems kind of unlikely because those groups seem to form and then disperse very quickly. Anyway, humans, as monster hunters, if you are one of those, if you play the games, you are causing anthropogenic changes to the ecosystem that you inhabit. Every time, you slay a Doshaguma or capture a Doshaguma or something like that, you're causing real changes to that ecosystem, and you are removing an animal from that ecosystem, but you're also contributing to that ecosystem in certain ways, because when this animal decomposes, then it'll produce nutrients that disseminate into the area surrounding it, and it'll feed scavengers. There are loads and loads of ways that you can both positively and negatively affect the ecosystem that you occupy as a hunter. Chotacabra are dubiously territorial. They don't seem to be particularly fond of each other, potentially because they compete for food, but they're also not as hostile towards other members of their species as some of the other monsters are. So this is another way that we look at ecosystems, a more historical lens, and that is paleontology. Paleontology is the study of the history of life on Earth. When we do paleontology, we're not just assessing the current state of an ecosystem, we're assessing the entire history of an ecosystem and considering how it got to the state that it's in. Do you think Balahar have sort of a mobbing predation? Yes, absolutely. Oh, thank you, Spliff, for the rose. I appreciate that so much. So when we do paleontology, like I said, we're not just looking at the modern state of an ecosystem. We're looking at the entire history of that ecosystem up until the modern point. And we can do paleontology in a few ways. In the real world, my job particularly, we do paleontology by looking at specimens of extinct or living organisms. We have access to a huge library of things that have once lived that now sit in the earth. Unfortunately, in Monster Hunter, the paleontology is not as robust as it is in our world. But we do still have some good examples of fossil organisms. For example, you can identify like 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4, 5 different species of ammonoid in this little rock here. This is, I believe, from Wilds. I forget if this is a screenshot that I took in Wilds or World. But there is still paleontology to be done, and we can very much use paleontological techniques to learn about the ecosystems that are present in Monster Hunter. And that's why I'm just going over what paleontology is and how it's done. I will get a little bit more in depth with it. In practice, a large part of paleontology has to do with the sorting of organisms into categories based on their understood evolutionary history. So which organisms we think share the most recent common ancestors. That sorting of organisms is called taxonomy. Now, when we do taxonomy, taxonomy itself is kind of an arbitrary term. It is really just the process of sorting living things into groups. That's like what taxonomy is. And you can sort them into real groups or... Oh my gosh, thank you for the heart me, Pasquale J. Thank you. So when we're looking at taxonomy, The particular brand of taxonomy that is used in paleontology and basically every modern ecological field is called phylogeny. This is something that you want to keep in mind. Phylogeny is specifically the sorting of organisms based on their evolutionary history, and this is what I'm really talking about. When we do phylogeny, there are a lot of ways to do it. In the modern day, a lot of phylogeny is done with genetics. We sequence the genomes of organisms, and we, look at how their genomes are different, and generally the ones that are more closely genetically related to their kin are more close to them evolutionarily. We don't have that luxury in the field of paleontology in many cases, or also in the field of researching Monster Hunter, which is why when I do my job, when I'm doing paleontological research, I don't incorporate genetic data sets because the animals that I work on are far too old to have any sort of preserved DNA. And when I'm doing my Monster Hunter videos, I obviously can't use genetic data there either. So there is kind of a layover in terms of the skill set that we use to determine the phylogeny of these organisms based on just certain traits about their bodies. This is an example of a very, very simple, what is called a phylogenetic tree. And this is an arrangement of organisms based on their hypothetical relatedness. I want to go over what these sort of groups are called, as well as what the different parts of the tree is, the anatomy of the tree, if you will. So firstly, let's go over the anatomy of the tree. This is the root. This is the base of the tree. So this is a root, and I will try to write here with my mouse, and hopefully everybody can read that because my handwriting is not great even without a mouse, as you would know if you've seen any of my videos on TikTok or YouTube. But this is the root. This is the base of the phylogenetic tree. And next up here, we have, if this is the root of the tree, what would you call these structures in chat? I want you to guess what you think these would all be called, to the best of your ability, because it's fairly intuitive if we're going with the tree analogy. So the root is down here, and then you have all these things that are coming off of the root. I'll give you a few moments. Yes, there we go. Very correct answer by Minislav in chat. These are called branches. These are the branches of a phylogenetic tree. Great job to everybody who got that right. Very, very proud of you. So these are all branches. And this is a little bit less intuitive. These little meeting points where the phylogenetic tree bends are called nodes. So these are all nodes. Let me write nodes there. Apologies for my bad handwriting again. The thing about certain phylogenetic trees is that oftentimes, but not always, the lengths of these branches represent hard data, but that is not always the case. If we can get a pretty rigorous or robust data set of fossil data and molecular clock data or something else that tells us how long the organisms in the tree have been evolving, then we can use these branch lengths to definitively represent like how long the organisms have gone after they diverged. But in Monster Hunter, we don't really have that luxury. Next thing, next phylogenetic term that I want to go over here is what is called the difference between monophyly and paraphyly. So a monophyletic group includes one organism or one species and all of its descendants. I just realized that I also forgot to go over what these ends are called. So the ends of the phylogenetic tree, these are called taxa. So every point on the tree is called a taxon. So these are all taxa together, and then taxon is the singular. So a species, a genus, anything that is going to be at the tip of the tree is called a taxon. And in this case, we have three taxa here. We have Brachydios, a brood wyvern, and then Blanganga here, and then Copper Blanganga. I definitely want to go over the skeletal anatomy of a lot of the wyverns in Monster Hunter Wilds in the future, and I will definitely make a kind of a video going over all those different adaptations at some point. But when we are grouping taxa together, there are two kinds of groups that we can create. We can create paraphyletic groups or monophyletic groups. When we create a monophyletic group, it is going to be a grouping of an organism and all of its descendants. So I'm going to use blue here to denote our monophyletic group. This is one monophyletic group, and this is another monophyletic group. So this group, both of these monophyletic groups, include the organism that gave rise to all of these different creatures, and then all of their descendants. So if there was something hypothetically more closely related to copper Blanganga than it was to the white Blanganga, then we would absolutely call that a part of this monophyletic group. Now, there are also paraphyletic groups that we can use to sort organisms based on traits just other than their evolutionary history. When we're creating a paraphyletic group, it's going to include just a few select taxa, not necessarily their common ancestors, or not necessarily the descendants of their common ancestors. So we can create a paraphyletic group that only includes Brachydios and copper, or not copper Blanganga, white Blanganga. So this group is paraphyletic because copper Blanganga is more closely related to white Blanganga than white Blanganga is to Brachydios, but copper Blanganga is still excluded here. How much does a dinosaur egg sell for? It came from a Stegosaurus. Dinosaur fossils tend not to be actually worth a huge amount because they're worth a lot more for research than they are for collection. If you have location data on that, I would suggest donating it to a museum. But if you don't have location data, there's not that much research that can be done on it, unfortunately. I would like to cover Kezo at one point. So the next principle that we're covering here is geology. And I'll be quick here, particularly because there's a lot of intricacies of geology and a lot of it gets into chemistry, and because we're mostly talking about natural history here as opposed to, super going in depth with like active geochemical processes. Oh my gosh, we have so many gifts. Thank you, Joe Evans, for the tiny diny. I didn't even, oh my gosh. Yeah, thank you, Joe Evans, for the tiny diny. I really appreciate that. I hope you're still here to hear me say that. I definitely try not to go too long without thanking folks. So geology is important here for two reasons. It tells us what sort of ecosystem the organisms that are living in it currently occupy, and it also tells us how the ecosystems have changed over time, what those ecosystems were like in the past. So this is an example of a geochemical cycle. This is the phosphorus cycle, and it shows how nutrients are being moved throughout the ecosystem, and geology is very important here. And I'm not going to go super in depth into the phosphorus cycle right now because that's not incredibly relevant. But also here we have an example of how geology can inform us about the past of ecosystems. So this is not a stromatolite. This is a this is this is a stromatolite. I thought it was a banded iron formation and then I flip-flopped. No, this is a stromatolite. And what a stromatolite is it's a series of, this one in particular is from Australia, I believe. It's about 3.4 billion years old, which is crazy to think. This is almost as old as life itself. And what a stromatolite represents is there are these layers of bacteria that are sitting here. And then as these little microbes and bacteria grow in their layers, dust and sediment starts to settle on top of them. This is underwater. So it's underwater sediments that are settling here. And then those sediments settle down on top of the stromatolite, and then they get covered with another layer of bacteria. And so we have, basically, if you go this way, you have a complex history of bacteria grow here. You can find out about these bacteria at the bottom. Then sediments get deposited on top of them, and now we can have information about these sediments that now gets sealed in by another layer of bacteria that we can learn about. And then another layer of sediments, and so on and so on. So this is a really, really interesting and cool example of how geology can tell us about the history of ecosystems. How does geology affect active ecosystems? Let's get into this now with this helpful image of the Windward Plains. Organisms do not just subsist on nutrients from each other. It's not so simple as you may have been taught as, the lion eats the zebra and the zebra eats the tree. And the tree takes nutrients from the lion when the lion dies. It is a little bit more complex than that, of course. The plants here are not just pulling nutrients from the organisms that die around them and nutrients from their soil. They're also taking up nutrients from the water. Now, how do nutrients get into this water? Water erodes rock as it travels, and as it erodes that rock, it's picking up those nutrients. So perhaps as this stream moves down a hillside, it's taking up nutrients that are involved in the chemical composition of these rocks here. So the chemistry of those rocks up on the hills of the Windward Plains would very much dictate what sort of nutrients are available in high quantities in this environment. Those inform us of what are called our limiting factors. A nutrient that is not particularly available is going to be a limiting factor for the growth of organisms in this ecosystem. So for example, if there's very little iron that's being deposited here, organisms need iron to grow. If there's not iron that's being brought in, then iron is our limiting factor. The amount of iron is pretty directly determining how organisms can grow. When animals that live here, which are called consumers, eat the plants that are uptaking this nutrient, anything, nutrients, toxins, chemicals, whatever, that stuff gets taken into the bodies of these animals. So if you are an animal that's coming by and you're eating this plant, and that plant has absorbed nutrients and toxins and elements from the water around it, it's going into your body, and it'll go up the food chain just like that. What is an ecosystem? Ecosystems are systems that are formed by the interaction of organisms with their environment, which includes other organisms and the local geology. Ecosystems are categorized into biomes, which is a categorization system that is largely based on the temperature and precipitation, which is pretty generally informed by the latitude and altitude of an ecosystem. I'm good. You have got to make a notebook journal like Alma's. I do. I actually do have an Alma. I do have an Alma journal right here. Let's see if I have an open page. People keep telling me I have to do this. I've already done this. All right, this is my Rathalos entry. I don't know if you can see that so well, but check my page. I have loads of videos going over my journal. Yeah. It is possible, Shadow the Hedgehog. Ecosystems are categorized into biomes based on temperature and precipitation. Let's do an exercise, chat. This is a graph. This is called a Whittaker diagram, and this categorizes it categorizes ecosystems into biomes based on their annual temperature and average annual precipitation. So, what biome do we think the Windward Plains falls into? And the answer can be multiple because a lot of these biomes a lot of the areas in Monstron are fairly diverse, and actually include multiple biomes within them. So if you think that the Windward Plains fall into any of these specific categories, please type that in chat, and then I will tell you whether or not you are correct or incorrect. And then we'll do the other areas as well. What did you major in? I currently am studying environmental science, and I work as a museum preparator and assistant researcher. Temperate grassland. I actually don't know if that's correct. I wrote these down, and I'm going to press the answer to reveal them momentarily. I haven't played Monster Hunter. I'm assuming shrubland. It is pretty definitively a subtropical desert and kind of hot, low precipitation savanna. The Windward Plains is mostly just a desert. It has many dune areas. It's got a wide variety of very hot, very dry ecosystems. And one thing that is very important for the Windward Plains in terms of categorizing it is that it has dry thunderstorms. So by the time storms reach the Windward Plains, they've rained out all of their precipitation, and you're just getting thunder, which indicates to me that it's probably quite inland. However, the Windward Plains does seem to get a little bit of precipitation carryover, which is how it's able to grow such high amounts of plants in that kind of grassland area right near the base camp, because it sits right next to the scarlet forest. And so it does get these like spikes in precipitation whenever the scarlet forest experiences rainstorms. And so it is both a subtropical desert and a little bit of a savanna. Next up is the scarlet forest. This one is a little bit more intuitive. The scarlet forest is very, very heavily in one of these categories, and I'm very sure that everyone will be able to identify it. If you want to type in chat what kind of biome you think the scarlet forest is, it is known for being hot and having a lot of rain. The scarlet forest, in fact, almost subsists entirely on rain. It rains so frequently in the scarlet forest. It's really crazy. Unfortunately, I'm not doing guests for this stream. I will accept questions in chat once we get to the end of the lecture. But all right, there we go. Scarlet forest. Oh, is it gonna go? There we go. Okay. Scarlet forest is a tropical rainforest. It is very hot. It's surrounded on all sides by quite hot... Oh, yeah. I tried to circle that and then it wasn't going. So it's just going to be that mess right now. Yeah, so the scarlet forest is incredibly hot, as evidenced by its proximity to two other very hot areas. It's sandwiched right between the oil well basin and the windward plains. So it is evidently quite high in temperature. The scarlet forest also experiences a lot of rainfall, obviously, so it's got a ton of precipitation, and it doesn't seem to be tied to the point in the year so much as it is tied to like the inclemency event, which is a very like consistent sort of thing. Obviously, there's probably a wet and dry season. So next up is the oil well basin. The oil well basin is tricky, and I really couldn't come up with a definitive answer to this because most of our time spent in the oil well basin is spent in the depths of the canyons and the subterranean areas. And so reconstructing the ecosystem surrounding it is kind of difficult. Personally, I'm going to label it specifically as one of these, and I'm not really going to have anyone guess unless they really want to. But the oil well basin is tentatively positioned here as a cold desert because there's nothing to trap the heat that is being produced there, and so it seems like it will have inconsistent heat year-round, but really it's kind of anywhere in this sort of range because we have very limited information on the ecosystem above the oil well basin. And so I'm not really definitively set. I will do more research on the oil well basin when I get to the video, and I'll probably have a more definitive categorization there. But yeah. And then next we have the ice shard cliffs, which is very, very easily a tundra. It is cold. We have almost no precipitation, but there is a little bit, so it kind of tends to creep up towards this boreal forest. But there's obviously no plant growth there because it's just too cold. So there's that. It is very much possible to get more specific than these examples when we're talking about categorizing ecosystems. You can even break ecosystems down into little tiny subcategories. This patch of grass right here could be considered its own ecosystem, and we would have, very particular terms to describe that. This kind of dry land area could also be broken down into its own ecosystem. There's a lot of subdivision that can take place here, and we can get very precise. Once I get into certain areas of the Windward Plains and covering them in future lectures and videos, I will certainly use more precise language that more accurately describes the state and nature of all these places, but for now I'm just trying to familiarize everybody with these sort of basic ecological, biological, and geological terms in order to help everybody have an easier time learning about this stuff in the future. So what makes up an ecosystem? There are a variety of components, but the two main ones that we like to distinguish are abiotic and biotic factors. Abiotic factors are the non-living parts of an ecosystem. So anything from the sun to moving water, the chemistry of the sediment, the physical layout of the land, the geology, the geography, all that sort of things, all those sort of things, they can all shape the kinds of life that can emerge. Now, specifically when we're talking about abiotic factors in an ecosystem, we're usually looking at the sort of chemistry of the water. Hello, Dr. House Chan. Welcome, welcome. Which dinosaur could pull off my hat? None of them. I've interacted with many dinosaurs in my time. None of them have managed to take it off my head. So when we're looking at, for example, the oil well, these sort of mounds here, I would consider those abiotic factors that affect the ecosystem. Just as a kind of a quick and easy example, these are breaking up the exposure of heat from this area back here. So as heat is coming by, it's going to be blocked from there, and that causes changes to the ecosystem surrounding them. Presumably also this water being here, that's another abiotic factor. And that allows organisms to exist surrounding it because animals need to drink water in Monster Hunter and in real life. Are there any missing species in Monster Hunter ecological niches not being filled? Yes, and I will get into that eventually. So yeah, there's loads and loads of different non-living factors that can affect an ecosystem. Now let's get into the biotic factors. These are the opposite of abiotic factors, the living components to an ecosystem, the things that really make it run and tick. So the first of these, and not even debatably, probably the most important, are the primary producers. There are actually two really notable kinds of primary producers in Monster Hunter Wilds. There, just like there are, well, in real life, pretty much all primary production is done by photosynthesis, but it's a much smaller percent in Monster Hunter. Generally, primary producers are the organisms that turn carbon dioxide in the air into usable organic material and oxygen. Without primary producers, ecosystems would basically all collapse. Primary production in real life and Monster is most often photosynthetic. Plants and other organisms that absorb sunlight to create energy are photosynthesizers. So sunlight is coming in, sunlight's coming in, and then these mosses and these little water plants and these vines, they're all trapping that energy, producing oxygen. They're producing oxygen into the air, and then an animal can come by and breathe that oxygen. And then that animal is happy because it has plants to eat and oxygen to breathe. And there's another very important kind of primary production, which is especially important when we're talking about Monster Hunter. And this is something that often gets glossed over until much higher level ecology classes, I've found. But I really want to kind of early launch it here because it's going to be a heck of a time trying to explain how a lot of these Monster Hunter ecosystems work without teaching you all what chemosynthesis is. There are a variety of non-photosynthetic ways to produce heat. I say chemosynthesis. There's also methanogenesis. And this is, I believe, methanogenesis is primarily performed by the organisms that live like around deep sea vents. Either way, chemosynthesis and methanogenesis are two chemical reactions that organisms do to produce energy and take carbon dioxide out of the air without needing sunlight. There's kinds of photosynthesis that produce oxygen. There's kinds of photosynthesis that don't. Oxygenic photosynthesis is probably the most dominant form of photosynthesis, but methanogenesis and chemosynthesis are very much important for Monster Hunter because when we're talking about primary producers like this Wilk, I don't know if you would consider Wilk a primary producer per se. I would. It is really dependent on whether or not you would consider Wilk to be alive, or you would consider the Dragon Torch to be alive, or the Land Spine to be alive, the thing that the Wilk comes out of. Either way, there is something which is taking in carbon dioxide from the air without the need for photosynthesis, without the need for sunlight to assist it, and converting it into usable energy for the organisms that surround it to allow it to be consumed. So this gets into something very, very important to realize. Ecosystems are not closed systems. When we think of a closed system, you might think of a glass jar. And it is, in fact, true. A sealed glass jar can contain an ecosystem. There was a famous one, I believe it was in, I think it was in the Smithsonian. One of the Smithsonian museums, they had a glass jar that lived completely unaided for many, many years. It was totally sealed, and it sat out in the courtyard. And it was completely sealed up. And you would think of that as a closed system. You would think that it was a perfectly contained ecosystem that nutrients didn't have to come in and out of, that could maintain itself for many, many years completely unaided. However, it's not a closed system. Thank you, Spliff, for the roses. I very much appreciate that. Because it was taking in energy from the sun. Primary producers can't do their work without getting energy from outside the ecosystem. It's not possible. So they either need chemicals to be ferried in for stuff like chemiosynthesis. They need a constant supply of those chemicals. Or they need energy from the sun, which is how most ecosystems function on Earth today, because the sun gives us energy. This gets into actually a lot of very common arguments against evolution and how to refute them. A lot of people tend to say that because like the laws of thermodynamics dictate that entropy should increase, evolution is impossible. And that's not true for a few reasons. One, evolution doesn't really have anything to do with entropy, but the idea that complexity increases over time in a closed system, violating, they think that because complexity increases over time on Earth, that violates the idea of entropy increasing over time in a closed system. The Earth is not a closed system. We're constantly getting energy from the sun. We're constantly getting energy from, other places. So much in the sense of, a fish tank being warmed with a heat lamp. The Earth is constantly being warmed and given energy from outside sources, much like the Monster Hunter ecosystems. Hello, Pierre Watt. Welcome. Big takeaway point from here. Ecosystems are not closed systems. They need energy from other places. And that energy always has to come from somewhere, and it's incredibly important to identify those sources of energy and nutrients from the outside, because without them, the ecosystem would collapse. And when we're looking at how an ecosystem functions, you want to start from the foundations. What gets done with all that energy, though? It gets brought into the ecosystem, it sticks around. The producers use it to grow themselves, but obviously the producers aren't growing with all of that energy. They end up storing a lot of it in their bodies, and it gets consumed by other organisms before they can use it. So consumers are organisms that can't generate their own energy. They can't fix oxygen from the air. They can't fix carbon dioxide from the air and turn it into oxygen. They can't do chemiosynthesis or methanogenesis or any of these other fancy chemical reactions that would allow them to just plainly coexist in an environment. And good for them, because these guys do respiration that often counteracts those producers. So they take in the byproducts of those producers. Most often the producers are making oxygen, and these guys are inhaling oxygen, putting out carbon dioxide, so there's this great balance. These organisms need to take in energy from other organisms, as I've said here. This is important. And they eat both consumers and producers. So this harpy eagle, for example, is an example of a consumer that only eats other consumers. It's what we would call a secondary, tertiary, potentially apex predator. I'm not super involved in knowing exactly where this animal sits in its food web, but it is an animal that exclusively eats other animals. However, there are organisms that eat both other producers and other consumers. So an omnivore, for example, is an animal that includes both producers and consumers in its diet. It would be an animal that eats plants and other animals. A cow is an animal that eats pretty much exclusively producers rather than eating consumers, although cows sometimes supplement their diet with meat. Point being, consumers have a varied diet, which includes both other consumers as well as some producer organisms. This is an example of a very basic food web that I've constructed for the Windward Plains. So here we have an example of a plant. This is an ephemeral blossom, which represents our primary producer. It is a photosynthetic plant. It has these beautiful leaves that are filled with chlorophyll. So there's CO2 coming in through here, and it's pushing out oxygen. But it also traps energy within itself. And that energy is very, very tasty for these Dolphodon and these Keratinoth. These guys are both taking energy out of this ephemeral blossom. They're gobbling it down, and they're converting it into energy within their own bodies. They're usually turning it into sugar or something analogous to that. There's also probably a fair amount of sugar just trapped within the plant itself. Where are monster hunters on the food web? That is a great question, and I will point that out in just a moment. And these Gagios are eating these Dolphodon. So these Gagios are an example of secondary consumers, just like these Doshagama. So these guys are consumers that eat other consumers. And another thing to note here is that the energy that is going up the food web is diminishing as it does. So we're starting with a very large amount of energy in these night flowers, and then it's splitting off. So it's getting smaller and smaller. The amount of energy that gets passed on, the fraction gets smaller and smaller. It's a structure of diminishing returns, basically. And so predators get probably about a tenth, I think it is. There's like this general rule about it that I have not written down, unfortunately. But there's a general rule that only a very small fraction of the energy consumed by an organism on the food web gets passed on to the organism that sits above it, which is why food webs don't tend to progress ad infinitum. You don't get an animal that eats an animal that eats an animal, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it's about there. And when we're looking at, food webs, they tend to only have a few levels because of that, because the energy just can't possibly be sustained. It's also why apex predators, like Ray Dow, for example, tend to have a very small population compared to secondary and primary consumers, and even more so primary producers, because the amount of energy that is in the ecosystem needs to get boiled down like maple syrup to a crazy degree before it actually reaches Ray Dow. How would ore eaters like Basarios or Gravios fit within a food web? That is a really good question. I believe, technically, they would be sitting somewhere between primary consumers and primary producers, because they are taking in like inorganic material from their ecosystem to generate energy and creating energy within their own bodies. But they also might be doing that via symbiosis with some kind of algae or bacteria that sits within their body that is the actual primary producer that is converting that to energy. So I would say they're probably primary consumers. Where do things like the Guardians fit? The Guardians are primary consumers. And I actually talked about that in my Fulgur Anjanath video, because the Guardians are eating the Wilk, and the Wilk is the energy byproduct of a primary producer. Anyway, so these Gagios here are an example of a secondary consumer, and then Ray Dow here is a tertiary consumer. It's also an apex predator because there are no consumers specialized in eating Ray Dow. Monster hunters actually are a part of the food chain. They do eat quite a lot of stuff. When we're talking about eating, generally monster hunters would fit as secondary consumers, but if you choose to get a little bit gourmet with it, you can actually grill and eat Ray Dow tail, as well as a bunch of the tails of the other monsters. So here we're going to draw a pair of monster hunters. We're going to give one of them a greatsword because I love the greatsword. My artistic prowess is unmatched. So there's our greatsword, and then this one is going to have, we'll give this one a charge blade, because I also like the charge blade. So this one's going to have a charge blade. There we go. If you want to see more of my excellent art, please sub. You get free scans of all of my art when it gets made on my Discord. I upload it there. I promise it's better than the stuff that I'm doing in this presentation. And so anyway, these monster hunters, they are generally eating Dolphodon, Keratinoth. They also eat the night flowers. They eat loads of stuff as a monster hunter. You're an omnivore, so they kind of sit everywhere. They're heterotrophs. They eat multiple things, and that's true of a lot of consumers. So generally, we define an animal by the highest level of the food chain that it sits at. Ray Dow, for example, is an apex predator, not just because it eats secondary consumers. It also eats primary consumers like Keratinoth. But it sits at the top not because it is not because it eats the thing that is second from the top, but because nothing else eats it, if that makes sense. Let's go over some key points from this lecture, which I am happy to do if you either, and elaborate on these if you want. If anybody in chat has any clarifying questions about these sorts of concepts, please let me know. I'm just going to go over some key points here, largely because a lot of people came in late or that sort of thing. Could a primary consumer be considered an apex like rhinos? Well, if a primary consumer was the highest trophic level in its ecosystem and it was not actively preyed upon by anything else, then yes. But rhinos do, I believe, face active predation from a variety of organisms. So I don't know if rhinos would be an excellent example for that, but in certain areas, if you had, a giraffe in a paddock, and that paddock was your ecosystem, and there were no predators of that giraffe in that paddock, then that giraffe would be both a primary consumer and an apex predator. Because it is only eating things. There is no organism in there that is subsisting on the giraffe population and eating it. So these are our key points. Ecology is the study of ecosystems. Ecology is the study of ecosystems that exist and the interactions that occur within them. Paleontology is the study of the history of the natural world, which includes the history of ecosystems. Phylogeny is the sorting of organisms into groups based on relatedness. So if you remember our little phylogenetic tree here. Okay, this is phylogeny. Oh my gosh, thank you for the galaxy. Wow. Oh, thank you so much, Rimuru the Demon Slime. I very much appreciate it. It helps me do these lectures more often. And I sincerely hope you stick around to learn a little more. So this is phylogeny. And this is the sorting of organisms into groups based on phylogenetic relationships, which is their most recent shared common ancestor. Ecosystems are controlled by their geology and not just the organisms in them. Ecosystems would look very different if they occurred in different geological situations. The reason that the ice shard cliffs look so different from the windward plains is, oh my gosh, holy W. That's 10 of the W coins. Oh my gosh, thank you, Hidden Keratin, so much. So the windward plains would look incredibly different from the ice shard cliffs, even if they were in the same temperature. Oh, I'm not going to be able to get through these sentences. That's 19, 20 Ws. Oh, I'm tweaking. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I'm not going to be able to finish this lecture if people keep gifting. I'm not going to be able to get through this. Thank you, Hidden Keratin, so much. Oh my gosh. And so the ice shard cliffs would look incredibly different than the windward plains, even if they existed at the same latitude and the same climate. Just because the geology of the ecosystem is different, because different organisms can coexist on cliffs compared to an open area like the plains. Ecosystems can be sorted into biomes. You can do this with a variety of techniques, a variety of precisions. We sorted them today based on their precipitation and temperature, but I will get more specific into how we sort those ecosystems in the future and get a little bit more in-depth with the kinds of categorizations that we can do, because we very, very much only scratched the surface, and I also only covered terrestrial, like T-Rex, oh my gosh, terrestrial ecosystems in this lecture. We really didn't get into the underwater ones, which is something that I will absolutely do, especially considering that two very, very interesting and cool leviathans are coming to wilds relatively soon, Lagiacris and Mizutsune, that I'm going to cover exceptionally soon. Mizutsune comes out in about 5 days. I got a lot of papers to read for work, but after I get off of work, then we're gonna lock in on Mizutsune. I'm gonna be streaming my research process for it, which is gonna be me slaying a bunch of Mizutsune with my subs. So if you are a subscriber, make sure you can DM me on Discord or on here. Let me know when you're available, because I will try to make it so that stream occurs at a time when everyone is available to do it. Hi, Sebastian Solis. Anyway, energy needs to be introduced to ecosystems from outside, fixed by producers, and then it moves up the food web through trophic levels. I forgot to mention that these categories are called trophic levels. So apex predator is a trophic level, primary consumer, secondary consumer, primary producer. These are all trophic levels. And they're called trophic levels in association with the terms for some of these groups. So an apex predator is an example of a heterotroph. Which means that it eats multiple things, and primary producers are organisms called autotrophs. That means that they generate their own energy within themselves. I do have a Discord. I have a sub-only Discord for folks who want to access my art. I just upload it on there. I'm sorry, Alistar, if you can't hear me quite well. I sincerely apologize. Please, everybody, let me know if you're having any sort of audio issue. This microphone can be kind of quiet, but it is pretty solid. But anyway, so energy moves up the food web through trophic levels, and that's not just true of energy and calories and nutrients. It's also true of toxins, which we'll get into. So there's a process that is called biomagnification, so this red line is representing energy. But this green line, because it's nasty and green like poison, is going to represent a toxin. So if there's a toxin in the soil here, it's going to be absorbed by these ephemeral blossoms. And then, oh no, these keratinoths are going to eat this. And every time these keratinoths eat an ephemeral blossom that has toxin in it, I have heard of the Duonicus discovery. I talked about that a couple streams ago. Every time these keratinoths eat an ephemeral blossom, they're consuming an entire ephemeral blossom's lifetime worth of toxin. So this plant has been absorbing toxin through a process called bioaccumulation throughout its entire life. And it's going to sit in this plant. It's not going to be, absorbed or have anything done with it. And then it's going to go into these keratinoths. And these keratinoths are going to eat poison throughout their entire life. So these guys are going to absorb little bits of toxin throughout their entire life as they eat ephemeral blossoms, because these guys probably eat 10, 20 a day. In terms of plants, they eat a lot of plant mass. And as these guys eat plants, it's going to accumulate in their bodies, and they're eating lifetimes worth of plants. And then every time a doshaguma eats a keratinoth, then oh my gosh, this doshaguma is going to have a huge amount of toxin in it. And this doshaguma is going to, every time, for every meal, it's eating an entire lifetime's worth of toxin from these keratinoths. And then when this Ray Dow finally gets to that doshaguma and eats that doshaguma, how many ephemeral blossoms worth of toxin do you think it's eating every time it preys on a doshaguma? Which is crazy, absolutely crazy. So that is a way that toxin moves up through ecosystems. That's why when you eat a predatory organism, the amount of toxin that you are ingesting is very much... Now, the frenzy virus is an interesting case, because the frenzy virus isn't necessarily just an inert toxin. It multiplies. It's an organism in its own. Well, a virus isn't really an organism, but a virus does multiply. It is debated whether or not viruses can be considered alive, but the virus does multiply. I don't think Gormagala canonically is the originator of the frenzy virus. It's just co-evolving with it. We'll get to that more in the question section. But this is a non-multiplying toxin. This is just like, we'll call it element X. If there is one atom of element X in every ephemeral blossom, and a keratinoth eats 200 ephemeral blossoms throughout its entire life, now there are 200 atoms of element X within this keratinoth. Doshaguma has to eat another 200 ceratinoths to survive throughout its entire life. This is a very small number, by the way, but now there are like 40,000 atoms of element X within this doshaguma, and then this Ray Dow is eating a doshaguma every 3 days. Which, if there's a toxin introduced in an ecosystem, Anything that eats this Doshagama is going to get a huge amount of that toxin. And therefore, Ray Dow will be in kind of a bad situation if that toxin is being propagated. Which is why humans are in kind of a bad situation with the amount of mercury that is in fish. So when we eat big predatory fish like tuna or swordfish, they're going to have a lot of mercury in them because they eat a lot of other fish throughout the course of their lifetime. That's also why shark meat tastes really bad, because they accumulate a high amount of urea. Their meat tastes like pee-pee, like urine. Anyway, so that's how energy and toxins move up through the trophic levels. That's basically what we covered today. This is what we're going to talk about next time. I want to look at specifically the eastern dunes of the Windward Plains. I'm going to try and put that together. Throughout the week, I might get a lecture out by the end of the week. I might not. We'll see when I can record another one. Otherwise, I'll do it when I do it, and I will try and make a big stink about it so everybody knows when it's happening, so you guys can make it on time. I also want to talk about the basic groupings of organisms, both in the modern day and in Monster Runner, and how those groups are created. So like kind of a little bit more in depth with taxonomy, and also how maybe a little bit about how evolution occurs. Evolution is a very important concept to grasp when we talk about organisms specifically, as well as ecosystems. But I think if you're going into an organism and you're looking at its evolutionary history, I do have a Discord. It's unfortunately only available to subscribers. But if you have questions for me outside of the stream, you can always DM me. My DMs are open, and I will do my best to answer them as quickly as possible. So we'll be going over the eastern dunes of the Windward Plains, talking about Balahara, sand stars, a lot of little burrowing organisms, those little flying winged drakes. I forgot the name. Shoot, I completely forgot what they're called. The noisy ones. The ones that are kind of like the Noyos from Monster Hunter World in the Wildspire. I will chat about that. I'm going to have an open question section in just a second. Thank you, Brick Floatsmore. Oh, thank you so much. Yes, Bonos. That's exactly what I was thinking of. And then I'll chat maybe a little bit about Ray Dow, but I don't know if I want to get super into Ray Dow in that episode, because that's kind of the entire Windward Plains ecosystem in terms of what Ray Dow sits over. So yeah, that is this little lecture here. Thanks everybody for coming by. If you made it on time, or if you didn't, I very much appreciate your attention and your support. And now it's open question time. So I'm going to go through and answer all the questions that I didn't get to in chat. And if you have any other, oh my gosh, who just donated 20 tiny dinosaurs? Thank you. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Yeah. So Ethan Jones said, can you talk briefly about oxygen delivery in relation to size? I can. It really depends on what group of organisms you're looking at, because there are a variety of oxygen delivery systems for terrestrial organisms. In general, terrestrial organisms are not that limited by oxygen density, or the amount. Partial pressure of oxygen is usually how it's measured in the atmosphere for like terrestrial organisms. For example, when you're thinking about like the giant bugs of the Carboniferous period, they got big not necessarily because there was a particularly large or high concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere compared to the modern day, which there was, but that's not necessarily the leading cause. It seems more likely that that was caused by a lack of terrestrial organisms filling those secondary, tertiary consumer niches. Thank you. You have a good day too, Sebastian Solis. So stuff like Arthropleura was only really able to get big because it wasn't competing with tetrapods, which are just much more efficient. And they generally outcompeted those bugs. They ate them. And so bugs got smaller in terms of a defense mechanism. If you're looking at how big dinosaurs got, that actually has to do a lot with the structure of their respiratory systems. So dinosaurs were able to get so large because their respiratory systems, much like those of modern birds, which are dinosaurs, are so incredibly efficient. And when we're looking at that sort of organism, as well as Another reason we know why it didn't have so much to do with oxygen is because Mesozoic oxygen levels. The Mesozoic is the geological era when dinosaurs were dominating the Earth, which they kind of still are, but in a different way. The oxygen levels of the Mesozoic are actually quite similar to what they were today. Brick Floatsmore says, are there any missing species not filling ecological roles in Monster Hunter? Absolutely. There are spots in Monster Hunter where there are like these little gaps in the ecosystem that are possibly populated by like recently extinct species. It is possible that you could identify that sort of situation for the Ice Shard Cliffs. It is a little iffy, but Jindahad seems to be an animal with a very, very small population size, and does not seem to be particularly predatory towards a lot of the other organisms there. Now, it is considered an apex predator of the Ice Shard Cliffs, indicating that it is definitely, at the very least, a secondary consumer. However, my personal running theory is that Jindahad is more of a scavenger because it just seems to be very well equipped for scavenging. It's got a very large body size. It can cover vast distances, and it can move in very unconventional ways. So it can access corpses and organisms that are frozen in the ice, and then it can melt that ice with its like control over temperature, and then it can eat those organisms before anything else can really get access to them. So that's my personal theory for how Jindahad sits, and I think there's definitely room within the Ice Shard Cliffs for a predatory organism that kind of rules over the cliffs in a similar way to that Jindahad does, with a more, like, I guess, direct way of interacting with the organisms there. Ormagala is a recent introduction, and it seems to be refilling that niche, but I also would not be surprised if there is a recently extinct giant predator that existed in the Ice Shard Cliffs a short period of time ago. How long do you think that Mizutsune and Legiacris will affect the Scarlet Forest, says Splift? That's a very good question. It is an introduction of two large predatory organisms, particularly Leviathans. Legiacris will definitely put the hurt on Uthduna in terms of territory. Legiacris is a massive underwater predator that does a majority of its hunting underwater, and it seems to stick towards primarily open oceans. You know, this is kind of the opposite of a saltwater crocodile in the sense that it is a historically very oceanic animal. This is the first time we've ever seen Legiacris in freshwater that I can that is within my memory, and so it's very interesting to see how that could possibly change its behavior, change the way that it acts. You know, I have no idea if this is now a Legiacris that's going to be doing a lot of its hunting on land. You know, we saw it looking at or standing over a dead Dalthodon in the trailer for those very recent, like those very brief moments. So maybe this is a Legiacris that's now shifting towards a more terrestrial predation style. In that case, like, everything is out the window in terms of prediction, because I have no idea how this animal is going to behave differently compared to the Legiacris of the old world. For Mizutsune, the fact that there is a breeding male Mizutsune means that it is either accompanied by a group of female Mizutsune that are kind of just hiding out. Female Mizutsune are relatively low in population and are kind of like skittish and tend to be isolated from human civilization within the world of Monster Hunter, which is why you don't ever see them, you don't ever hunt them. The males are the ones that are really an issue. This is, I think, true for all of the members of the Fated Four. We don't get male Gameths, and we don't get female Astalos, Mizutsune, or Glavenus. But male Mizutsune in particular are very, very rowdy. They're like elephants in Must, and they tend to get really, really close to human settlements and just become very aggressive and cause a lot of issues. So definitely if there's a male Mizutsune, it could either be accompanied by a group of female Mizutsune that it's potentially trying to impress with that behavior, or it could be a migratory vagrant. A vagrant is an animal that is trying to migrate somewhere and then gets shifted off course. So, for example, the painted bunting is a bird that migrates from somewhere in the south. I forget exactly where. But it migrates, I believe, to South America over the winter. But there are some painted buntings that have a kind of reversed magnetic compass, and so instead of migrating south in their breeding season, they migrate north, and so they spend their winter, not their breeding season, their winter. They spend their winter up in the cold north of like the northeastern U.S. And so it could be a situation like that with the Mizutsune that we're seeing, where there's some ecological change that causes them to migrate wrong, and that's why we're only seeing male Mizutsune show up in the Scarlet Forest. Can you tell me fun facts about Utahraptors? My favorite fun fact about Utahraptor is that it has a very bizarre teeth in its jaw, or at least the layout of teeth in its jaw is quite weird. It has these sort of recurved teeth that stick forward, that are almost like parallel with the jugal, as its teeth get closer and closer to the front of its mouth. They kind of start to angle forward, which is really interesting to see. You don't ever really see that in dromaeosaurs. It seems unique to Utahraptor, and it is very similar to what we would see in animals like Meschikosaurus, like the Noasaurids. Could Brachydios exist? It's a really good question. Theoretically, Brachydios is actually not that implausible. It is definitely one of the most plausible explanations I've seen for an animal that can make explosions. It seems to house on its body a mold that undergoes some kind of rapid exothermic reaction that generates a large amount of heat and gas and then goes pop. And that seems to be how that mold reproduces and spreads its spores, which is a thing that occurs. Plants, I believe there are some plants that do kind of produce little explosions to spread their spores or seeds. And so with Brachydios, it seems to coexist with that mold by rubbing the mold all over its body and then using it as a weapon, which is something that also does exist. This is a kind of a combination of those spore-spreading molds, or spore-spreading plants and fungi that kind of pop to put their spores out, and then they're made a little bit more scary and intimidating, and then they're combined with another animal, which is called the boxer crab. And boxer crabs are a kind of crab that survive mainly by picking up sea anemones, holding them in their pinchers, and touching them to things that they feel threatened by. So if you try to pick up a boxer crab, it's not going to pinch you, because it's going to be holding a pair of tiny little sea anemones, and it's going to sting you with those sea anemones, which is very similar to what Brachydios does with the mold. And so it seems to be a case of coevolution between those two species. And in that sense, I think it is quite plausible. Which monster from Monster Hunter do you think in real life could fit our ecosystem best? That is a really good question. It depends on which ecosystem you're talking about. But I certainly think that a lot of the monsters from Monster Hunter are quite plausible in terms of their bodies. I mean, Doshaguma is really, really huge. That's one thing. People don't really understand a lot of the time how big the monsters in Monster Hunter are. That's the main thing that makes them like so jarring and so strange compared to modern animals. Doshaguma is it's definitely heavier, but it's almost as long and tall as an adult Tyrannosaurus Rex. And so Doshaguma is really big. I don't know if a Doshaguma could feasibly exist in the modern day in any sort of ecosystem, but something a little bit smaller. The arthropods in general are kind of out the window because arthropods on land can't get so big as they do in Monster Hunter, because the muscles of arthropods attach to their exoskeletons, and so they would need super, super thick exoskeletons to avoid breaking them whenever they move their limbs. The elder dragons and any of the giant arthropods in Monster Hunter are very much the ones that I think are the most reality defying, because arthropods in general just need such thick exoskeletons to get that big, and they would be too heavy to move on land. Aquatic arthropods can get quite large because they're not so constrained by weight. But a lot of the small monsters are incredibly feasible. A lot of the small monster designs in Monster Hunter they're just real animals almost. Like Gagios is something that could totally physically exist. I can imagine
I would not be surprised if we found some early Triassic Archosaur that just looked like Gagios. Cetus is an interesting case because it does seem to be able to produce oxygen independently or like in association with the algae that lives in its beard, which is interesting. Cetus is probably the most plausible elder dragon because it doesn't seem to have an extra pair of limbs. Honestly, I think maybe one of the most plausible monsters in Monster Hunter are like Gobel and the Piscine Wyverns. Yeah, Gobel might be my pick. It's basically just an early tetrapod that has kind of gone back to the water. Kirin would be feasible in terms of its anatomy because it's basically just a scaly horse. And mammals do sometimes produce scales in association with hair. The issue with Kirin is that it produces lightning with no real electrical organ besides the horn. And it produces lightning in a way that is not kind of coming from its body. It like calls down lightning, which is, I mean, it's cool. It's very cool, and I do love those little bits of hard fantasy in Monster Hunter, because they make the world feel more magical. And it is a magical world, but it is a very believable magical world. And because the world is so believable, when you get those magical moments, they feel very impactful. That's why I love the Fatalis fight so much, is it's just filled with that. You don't often get fights in Monster Hunter where, similarly to Fatalis, you have an animal that is so supernatural, affecting the environment around it in such a natural way. Like Safi Jiva, when it does that big blast, it doesn't really affect the environment that much. But every time Fatalis does this big cone of fire, parts of the castle like fall apart. It's great. Why does Raydow sound like a whistle when it attacks? That's a great question. That actually is covered on this slide right here. So the tail of Raydow is covered in, as well as its wings, are covered in fulgurite, which is a material that kind of forms when lightning strikes sand in the universe of Monster Hunter. And this does occur. Sand does turn to like a glass-like substance when it gets hit by lightning. I don't know if it's actually called fulgurite in real life. I don't think it is. But fulgurite forms in Monster Hunter when lightning hits sand, and Raydow is an animal that generates copious amounts of electricity throughout its entire body. And so when it rolls around in the sand, when it rubs sand on its body, the fulgurite attaches to its scales, which are apparently specially designed to hold an electric charge. In order to conduct, to like attach that fulgurite to it, if you look at the item descriptions. So it attaches to the osteoderms, which are the kind of scale on Raydow's tail. And when fulgurite hits itself, when two pieces of fulgurite hit together, they make like a chiming sound. And you might think that this is limited to like kind of incidental wind chime noises, but when those two things vibrate together very quickly, you could get a sound very, very similar to something like the club-winged manakin, which is a kind of bird that produces these like very high-pitched whining sounds, like a whistle, almost exactly like that, not by whistling with their voice, but by striking their feathers together, and their feathers are thickened and they're hard, and so you would get something almost identical. Raydow might be just shaking its scales very rapidly, which would make sense if they're being subjected to large amounts of electricity, and that could be producing the whistle that Raydow makes when it shoots its lightning. If you were to have a unique monster based on a real-life animal not in the series, what would it be? That is a really good question. I think we are sorely missing out on pretty much every monster that is a like dinosaur monster is inspired by tyrannosaurids if it's inspired by theropods. I think we are really sorely missing out on a Acrocanthosaurus or Carcharodontosaurine inspired ice brute wyvern. I want a big two-legged brute wyvern, perhaps with a sail running along its back that can shoot out ice beams or something of the sort. I always also think the idea of having a monster with two elements is cool. I would love it if it was maybe a water element monster for most of the fight, and then when it got enraged, it could freeze itself. I don't know, I think that would be cool. We definitely need a Hadrosaur. Why does Devil Joe eat its own tail? I assume that's what you're asking about with the Pickle Rex. It is rumored to. I don't think it's actually been observed eating its own tail in any of the mainline games. It's kind of like a rumor within the community. But in lore, Deviljho eats its own tail because it has such a high metabolism that it needs to eat constantly. And this is actually a documented behavior in loads of living reptiles. I have a leopard gecko, or I had a leopard gecko. She didn't die. She's fine. I just had to rehome her. But I had a leopard gecko, and leopard geckos, when they drop their tails, will oftentimes return if that tail hasn't been eaten and eat the tail themselves, because that is free nutrients. If your defense mechanism was to take a steak out of your freezer and throw it on the ground, and that steak was still in the packaging and very edible, you would come back and you would eat that steak. Because that is free nutrients that you just removed from your body, that you expended to use that defense mechanism, or that were, taken from you, that you can very easily recuperate into your body by eating them. Yeah. If you have a unique monster, I already covered that one. Yeah. No, I think there's some really, really cool stuff in Monster Hunter. I do like the idea of bleed on a Carcharodontosaur-based brute wyvern, although there's kind of like a meme with Carcharodontosaurs being like bleed-focused animals that's not super based in research or like studies. I mean, obviously when an animal that big bites you, you're going to bleed, but the idea that they would bleed out their prey items is not well supported or well evidenced against. It's speculative behavior, and it is reasonable, but if we practice and depict a speculative behavior too much, then it becomes assumed by the paleo community, in much the same way that pronated wrists did. Before there were any real studies on how dinosaurs could articulate their wrists, it was just assumed that they held their wrists like this in just about every piece of paleo art. And so every time someone painted a dinosaur, they just did their wrists like this. But dinosaurs can't do that. If they do that, the wrist bones that they have kind of squinch over each other and they break. So dinosaurs cannot hold their wrists in a pronated fashion. They have to hold them inward with the thumb facing up. And that wasn't found out until like the early 2000s. And the reason that research wasn't done is because everyone just kind of agreed without performing any research to depict their arms going like this. Now, most of the ways that we depict dinosaurs acting and looking are fairly well researched, but there are still areas where work needs to be done. And in some cases, that work that is done violates our assumptions about their anatomy, because dinosaurs are very unique animals. Recently, there was a paper published that described an entirely new muscle in the cheeks of most dinosaurs. Which is bonkers. So, for example, if you see like this is gonna be so bad. If you see a Tyrannosaurus skull, oh, that's nasty. Okay, hold on. I have no idea how I can't undo it. Okay, I have to live with it. So this is gonna be our theropod dinosaur skull. Okay. This is so bad. Okay. I'm a paleo artist. I have to do better than this. So this is our theropod dinosaur skull. And this is the what is your favorite monster? My favorite monster is Lagiacrus. I love aquatic reptiles. So this is our theropod dinosaur skull. And the muscle that was described recently is something that is not present in living birds or crocodiles, but it is present in some lizards and some other groups of reptiles. And so it was assumed, because the closest living relatives of dinosaurs didn't have it, that they didn't either. And the muscle, I believe, is called... I don't know the name of it off the top of my head. It is... I think it's maybe the sternopterygoides. I don't know. Yeah. I'm losing it. But it goes from the bottom of this process up until, like, some point in the jaw. And the thing that is very significant about this is... I do love Shigaru Magala. That was one of my favorite fights in 4U. I haven't fought it in Rise because I haven't played Rise. The one thing that's significant about this is that this muscle sits outside of the jawbone. So it's sitting outside of this bone here. And so a lot of the time in paleo art, you'll see dinosaurs depicted with this like little flap of skin inside their mouth. And that was just assumed to be the case for a long time, because that's what we see in a lot of living reptiles like alligators and crocodiles and birds. But that seems to not be the case. It seems to be more like lizards, where they have kind of an actual lip that goes around there, that includes the muscle, and so that would be covered in scales and skin. It wouldn't really like seem that different from the rest of the mouth. So yeah, there's that. Is it the sternotaricoides? I cannot remember what that muscle is called. I've only had a week to internalize the name. Forgive me. Yeah, no, Shigara Magal is a great fight. Nargacuga is super cool. It's a very interesting example of potentially convergent evolution, potentially something else. I don't really know where it sits in the family tree, but it seems to be largely feathered. But it also has those like really bizarre external ears like Tigrex and like Barioth. What's one dinosaur you don't want to exist? It's a good question. If I could hit a button and bring back every dinosaur except for one, I think the dinosaur that we would learn the least about from bringing it back would be Psittacosaurus, because it's already so well researched. I also really don't like Psittacosaurus that much. I think it's not a very good looking animal. It's kind of ugly. It's a little ceratopsian from East Asia and southern Russia, and it kind of looks like this. This is my artistic interpretation of Psittacosaurus. And it's super well researched. It's one of the most well researched dinosaurs ever, because we have a wealth of very well preserved specimens from it. It has these amazing feathers on its tail as well. Seeing how Rathalos is the apex of the skies, which flying wyvern do you think best challenges him? Probably Astalos. Astalos put up a good fight against Rathalos. Ray Dow seems to be largely quite low flying. It doesn't really seem to spend a lot of time at high altitudes, as evidenced by those like kind of narrow, unslotted wings, as opposed to Rathalos' like big, like slotted wings, and it has a very reduced alula. Rathalos is very much seems to be adapted for like soaring behavior, and I would imagine that a Rathalos can put a lot of time in the air to cross an ocean or something of the sort. What's your favorite weapon? Greatsword. I don't know why it took so long to answer that. I'm like a diehard greatsword main. I was debating whether or not I should like acknowledge my other like weapons that I play, but I have like probably 70 to 90% of my hunts on greatsword across all the games. Yeah, I mean, I like charge blade. I like gun lance. I like a little bit of hunting horn. I like a little bit of dual blades. I like a little bit of sword and shield. A little bit of switch axe. But the greatsword is number one perpetually for me. Great bow. Bow is great. Yeah, the greatsword in Wild has a crazy offset attack. The greatsword is amazing. I really like it in Wilds because it's, I think, the only weapon that has both an offset and like a guard. So you can do offsets and power clashes, which is great if you're running the Doshaguma set, because the Doshaguma set gives you the set bonus that boosts your attack when you offset or power clash. I love Wild's greatsword so much. It's so good. So good, and it's great because it has a great ability to break monster parts. So I can use it for looking at the internal anatomy of some of these beautiful creatures, because not just the outsides of their bodies are modeled. When you break a monster part, you can get a pretty good look at its internal anatomy, which has helped a lot with my research projects and looking at how things fit together in the internal biology of a lot of these guys. Nice job. Nice. That's good to know, Split. We can probably get together 4 greatswords for the first Mizu hunts. What is the most unrealistic monster? It's a really good question. Definitely some of the frontier elder dragons. They're the burning freezing, I forget what it's called. There's the one frontier elder dragon that's like half on fire, half frozen. That is an animal that I confidently say does not abide by the laws of physics. That's good to hear, All-Star. Which monster would you improve in terms of physical design? I think I could make Chotacabra a little bit more interesting. It's kind of a not... I don't think it goes far enough into like the desert toad concept, because it's clearly very inspired by desert rain frogs in terms of its like behavior, but its body just doesn't communicate that. It kind of just reads like a fanged beast. And I think it could be a little bit more amphibian-like in terms of the way that it moves and the way that it looks. I think maybe the chin could go. I might do a Chotacabra redesign, but is there a type of insect that you would like to see made into a monster in a Monster Hunter game? Absolutely. Oh my gosh, there's so many beautiful, beautiful insects that I would love to see in Monster Hunter. Yeah. I mean, like, any sort of, like, orchid mantid. I would love an orchid mantis or a praying mantis inspired insect monster that can go invisible. I would also love a cephalopod monster that can go invisible. Anything that plays with invisibility or camouflage. I know it's cheap and I know it's annoying, but it would be so cool as a design choice. Yeah. I would also love to see some more interesting stuff with beetles. I'd like to see like a bombardier beetle type monster that shoots out like gouts of flame or something like that. I know we have like Desert Celtis, but there are so few beetle monsters. Yeah, definitely some kind of hymenopteron as well, like a wasp, like a real flying wasp that could really attack you from the air. What's a monster that you would love to make a subspecies of? So many. I want to see a water new Udra. I mean, we don't have an actual like proper water dwelling cephalopod yet, which is kind of crazy. But there's a lot you could do with that, I think. Any of the apexes from Wilds, I think would be so cool to see an apex or subspecies of. They're very tied to their ecosystems, so I think that would be hard, but I think it is possible. Yeah. There's a lot of good stuff out there that could possibly be done. Rhino beetle monster would be absolutely crazy. I mean, that's kind of Celtis, but I think they could push the Celtis concept farther. Celtis is like such an early game monster that it doesn't really use that prompt to the best of its ability. Are there any real life animals like Gormagala? In some ways, yes. I mean, there are animals that primarily hunt through smell and sound and taste. Obviously, like bats, velvet worms, any sort of like troglodyte organism, like cave-dwelling organisms that spend a majority of their time in complete darkness don't really have a point for eyes. But in terms of having a symbiotic relationship with a pathogen like Gormagala does, I'm not sure. Yeah, I've not done research into Gormagala so intensely yet. I would like to do a video on it. I could see a fire Ray Dow. I absolutely could. In terms of the metamorphosis of Gormagala, it is quite inspired by living insects, where they'll have like an instar form and then they'll molt into like a beautiful mature form that doesn't exist for a very long time. Although I think Shigara Magala lives for quite a while, which you would expect because it has like a mouth and it still has like a digestive system, at least from what I understand. But a lot of the insects that do molt like that tend to just not have a digestive system, and they spend their entire adult lives trying to look for a mate and then die. How many regular humans could beat Ray Dow? Do they have a tank? If they have a tank, I think they could beat Ray Dow relatively quickly. Since Espionage came back for Rise, what other frontier monsters would you like? I would love to see Barlagal. Barlagal is my like kind of only choice for frontier monsters that I want to see back at the moment. I think it's the one that would fit the best in Wilds, and I think it has a pretty sizable spot for it in the Ice Shard Cliffs. Humanoid monsters, I think that would be cool. To a certain degree. I think we could use a monster inspired by like an Ashdarkid pterosaur. I think they're very humanoid in some of their body movements. And the Fang beasts fill that niche quite well. Yeah. If you could have one weapon to Monster Hunter, what would it be? That is a very good question. That is a very good question. What kind of weapon would I add? Something with a grappling hook. Something that very much incorporates like a grappling hook that you can use to stick onto a monster. Gauntlets would be cool. Yeah. I would also like the Gugar's back. That'd be cool. Which monsters from every game you played was your wall for each title? Inactivity detected in your live. Oh my gosh, I have to complete the verification. Hold on. Go to Live Studio. Alright, I have to drag the puzzle piece. There we go. There we go. Okay. Sorry. In Try, it was probably like the first Legicris quest. I did not get far in Try. I need to go back and replay Try. Played it on the Wii with motion controls, so it was incredibly difficult. Yeah, I need to go back and replay Try. I will finish Try. For 4U, my wall in low rank, probably Monoblos in 4U. I carded on Monoblos a few times, but I got back in the saddle and got through it. I really love Monoblos though. It's incredibly. I'm incredibly fond of Monoblos. For high rank, probably the hardest fight that I had in high rank was I actually had quite a bit of difficulty with Zinogre and Celtis Queen. I mean, I didn't really get walled to such a high extent for you. In World, Diablos gave me quite a hard time. Yeah, Diablos in World. I really did not know what weapon I wanted to play at the time, so I basically threw every weapon I had against Diablos until I really understood what I wanted to do with it. So Diablos was my wall in base World, and then in Iceborne, I kind of got through Iceborne quite quickly. The monster that I really had a hard time with in Iceborne was Raging Brachydios, but that came out like way after I finished the game anyway. But yeah, Raging Brachydios was still fun. Within the main story of Iceborne, probably the monster I had the hardest time with was Barioth, even though I only fought it once. I beat it on the first try, but it took me about 48 minutes. Zinogre can kind of exist. It is very much an example of coevolution, which Monster Hunter loves to do. It has those bugs that exist in its fur that fly out and shock you. It's certainly more plausible because what Zinogre's Fulgur bugs are doing is they're flying onto you and then discharging electricity into you, which is relatively easy to explain biologically. So yeah, Zinogre, other than the fact that it's gigantic, could maybe exist. Yeah, Barioth was a hard time in Iceborne. It was like a huge difficulty spike, and even though I finished it, I like felt that so hard. Which Monster Hunter game do you think is the best, and which one has the most variety? Honestly, I gotta say Wilds is my favorite out of all the Monster Hunter games that I've played. Particularly because of the roster variety. I might double back on that when I finish Try, because I really did love Try in terms of its aesthetic and like the feel of the game, but I just could not handle it on Wii motion controls. So I'm gonna play Try on my own controller on my PC and see if I can enjoy it a little bit better there. I really did love 4U's roster variety. I mean, Generations Ultimate just has like objectively the best roster variety because it's like every monster. But yeah. Could Nargacuga be relative to Zinogre? It's certainly possible. I've seen a lot of people speculate on the potential relationship between fanged wyverns and flying wyverns. I don't know if I would place Zinogre closer to the fanged wyverns than I would to the other fanged wyverns than I would to the fanged beasts, because it seems to have hair all over its body. But also some of the fanged wyverns have hair on a lot of their bodies. And it's really a question of, is Zinogre's hair the same kind of integument that we see in like Doshaguma and the fanged beasts? Hiss and such. Hello, Divinax. If you were to add a new ailment/element, what would it be? Oh, ooh, that's a good one. That is a good one. On the monsters end, I definitely think there is a potential for some kind of like primer and detonator system. So like a monster that hits you with a status and then hits you with another attack. If you have that status, that attack has a different property. I think that would be cool. I love Great Jagras. Great Jagras is amazing. Yeah. Well, it's kind of Blast. Blast just goes off after a time period. But like what I'm imagining is you get slimed. Let's say that the status is called slime. You get slimed. And then if a monster hits a hunter with slime and a hunter without slime, they'll have different reactions to that attack. Maybe if the monster hits the hunter with slime, they just take extra damage. Maybe they get stuck. Maybe they get stuck and they can't get up or something. Yeah, like Teostra. Kultaroth is cool. It is incredibly large, and it's incredibly hot. Yeah, Nickelodeon Wyvern. The one thing that I think Kultaroth is a little bit implausible with in terms of its anatomy is just its size and its weight. Animals they occupy much more volume than they have surface area, and so it becomes harder and harder to disperse heat, especially for Kultaroth because, it's basically trapping all the heat right next to its skin because of that giant golden cloak that it has. But yeah, I mean, I don't think Kultaroth is impossible per se. I don't think it's out of the question for Kultaroth. It's definitely not the most bizarre animal anatomically. It's just a question of the scale. Your name is goated. Thank you. I love Dryptosaurus. It's one of my favorite species. I've actually seen Dryptosaurus in person multiple times. I'm quite close to the Dryptosaurus holotype geographically, so I can often go see it in person. Pop down and say hello. It's not a super complete specimen, but the claws are there. And those are some very cool claws. Kezu is weird. It's an example of like a cave animal kind of losing a lot of the things that make it recognizable. Like an Olm has almost no facial features, much like Kezu. Because animals in caves don't need to see. They don't maybe even need to smell that much. Kezu seems to operate almost entirely by smell and vibration. It's really cool, though. I think Kezu's awesome. It's a very bizarre design. Yes, I actually have played Path of Titans. I played occasionally with my partner. I mostly play the Isle. That's my dinosaur survival game of choice. Yeah, Kezu is incredibly bizarre. I hope they bring back Kezu in the 6th generation. Young Schwannosaurus is very awesome. I do love. How is Jindahad coming along in the book? It is certainly coming along. I have been focusing quite a bit on making sure that the neck anatomy is correct because it is very hard to get good screenshots of Jindahad's neck. But I have been doing a lot of research, just like on paper, into its potential ecology and its relation to the other leviathans. So Jindahad, I'm chugging along on it. Is there a type of Monster Hunter game that you would like to be made that's not like the main game, e.g. Monster Hunter Stories? Yeah. Yes. I have 2 selections for that. One of them is like a Monster Hunter like park builder game or like a nature preserve type game similar to Prehistoric Kingdom that I think you could really lean into like the ecology side of things, or like a zoo manager, because I think that'd be cool. And the other one is I think that you could have a tag team fighting game. I'm a huge fan of tag fighters, and I don't ever talk about this on this account because it doesn't seem to be particularly interesting to my audience. But I love tag fighting games. I love like Skullgirls. Dragon Ball Fighters is probably my main one. Guilty Gear Strive I think is now a tag fighter, but I also just really like Guilty Gear Strive. But I would love to see a tag style fighting game where your team is a hunter wearing the monster's armor and with that monster's weapon, and then the monster, and you can like tag out and play as the monster for like a limited amount of time by using your meter, and then you have to tag back in and play as the hunter. What is an elder dragon you would add to Wilds? Honestly, I would love to see Nergigante appear at the very end of the Wilds DLC to make it feel very powerful. I would say the same for Safi'jiiva, but Safi'jiiva is already quite challenging, so I don't think it's that out of the question. Like, Safi'jiiva, I think, has a fight that at least somewhat accurately represents its strength. Nergigante gets talked up in the lore so much, and it's such a cool design, but the fights of Nergigante in the game are really, really easy. It's like almost a complete pushover. And so I want to see them do like a really hard Nergigante fight in Wild. The same thing is true of Valhazak. How did Indominus kill the pack sauropods? Presumably they are like relatively domesticated apatosaurs. And so they didn't really have a reaction to it. That's what I'm thinking of. Otherwise, that would just be exceptionally unlikely if those were like wild sauropods. Do you think there should be a story based on this? Yeah, I think it'd be cool to see guild knights hunting down poachers. Guardian Nergigante would be crazy. That'd be insane. I think I have a hunch that in the DLC we'll start to see Guardian Elder Dragons. Especially because the story of Old Iberia seems to be so wrapped up in Elder Dragons. And this is going to be the last question that I answer because I do have to go now. Ooh, never mind. I have two really good questions. Add one Elder Dragon to real life. I would pick any of the Thunder ones so that we can get infinite clean energy. What is your favorite unsolved mystery regarding dinosaurs? This is a good last question. My favorite unsolved mystery regarding dinosaurs is the mystery of theropod dinosaur facial tissue. We just really don't have a lot of well-preserved theropod dinosaurs, which are the big two-legged meat-eating ones that have their faces preserved. So we don't know a ton, outside of the ones that are very closely related to birds, about what kind of covering they would have had on their face, how far in the feathered theropods the feathers would have gone down the rostrum. There's just a ton of unknown stuff about the way that a theropod dinosaur would have looked in life from the neck up. Anyway, thank you everybody for coming by. I really do appreciate you joining this stream. And I will try to get this lecture out on my YouTube as quickly as possible. As well as run another stream like this soon, where I cover, like I said, the eastern section of the Windward Plains, some basic phylogenetic grouping, stuff like that. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Have a good day, night, wherever you are off to. See ya.
Thank everybody for watching. And a huge thank you to all of my paid supporters. Without all of you, I couldn't make this content nearly as often. So thank you to Marksune Miku, Splift, DJ, Salvatore Mondillo, Pierre Watt, Brandon Rutherford, Cake Chad the Vast, and Brick Floatsmore. You guys are all super awesome. And another massive thank you for your support, and thank you everyone for watching to the end of the video. I will see you next time.